They didn't announce a banking summit, they called it a hunting trip. Because in 1910, the fastest way to destroy a central bank proposal was to let Americans believe Wall Street wrote it. So, the meeting happened quietly, remote, private, unrecorded. A small group left New York under assumed names. They avoided reporters, they avoided attention, they boarded a private rail car and traveled south to a secluded island resort off the coast of Georgia. Jekyll Island. It wasn't a government building, it wasn't a public forum, it was a private club owned by some of the most powerful financial families in America, and for 9 days behind closed doors, they worked on a blueprint. Not a speech, not a press release, a system. The panic of 1907 had made one thing clear. The United States economy had outgrown its financial structure. It was industrial, expanding, interconnected, but its banking architecture was fragmented, reserves were scattered, liquidity was rigid, and when fear struck, there was no central mechanism to respond. Congress had already formed the National Monetary Commission to study European central banking systems. But studying was not the same as designing. So Senator Nelson Aldrich took initiative. He assembled a small group of bankers, economists, and Treasury officials. Henry Davison of J.P. Morgan & Co., Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank, Paul Warburg, a banker deeply familiar with the structure of the German central bank. They were not there by accident. Each man brought technical knowledge of how liquidity, reserves, and credit actually functioned during a crisis. This was not a random gathering, it was concentrated expertise. But the design problem was delicate. America needed a central bank, but Americans distrusted central banks. The memory of earlier battles, especially Andrew Jackson's war against the Second Bank of the United States, still shaped political thinking. Any proposal that looked like one powerful bank controlling the nation would fail immediately, so the system had to balance perception and function. It needed central coordination, but it could not look centralized. It needed private banking participation, but it could not look privately controlled. It needed flexibility, but it could not look reckless. The solution they drafted was not a single institution, it was a network. Regional reserve banks distributed across the country, each one connected to a central governing authority in Washington. Private banks would hold shares in their regional Federal Reserve Bank, but national policy would be guided by a central board. It was a hybrid structure, part public, part private, part centralized, part regional, intentionally complex, because complexity was the compromise. At the core of the blueprint was one crucial idea: an elastic currency, money that could expand when demand for cash surged, and contract when conditions stabilized. Instead of watching reserves drain during harvest season, instead of watching banks fail because cash couldn't move fast enough, the system would be able to inject liquidity. It would discount sound assets, it would move reserves, it would act when panic began, not months later, not after collapse, during. When the men left Jekyll Island, they did not announce what they had built. The blueprint became known as the Aldrich Plan, and immediately, it faced political resistance. Critics argued that bankers had designed a system for bankers, that Wall Street would control the nation's money, and in part, the criticism was understandable. The meeting had been private, the participants were powerful, but the blueprint was only the beginning, because it still had to survive Congress, and Congress would reshape it, modify it, fight over it, and ultimately transform it into something politically acceptable. The secret meeting did not create the Federal Reserve. It created the architecture, the framework, the idea that America could build a central mechanism without surrendering political control. The panic of 1907 exposed the weakness. Jekyll Island designed the response, and in 1913, that design would become law, the Federal Reserve Act. And once it passed, the United States would finally have what it had lacked for decades: a central nervous system for its financial body. But the question that lingered did not disappear. If the system was designed by a small group of powerful men behind closed doors, who would ultimately control it? That is the next chapter.